Snowflakes fell gently on the bustling city, blanketing everything in a crisp, quiet beauty that contrasted with the bright lights and hurried footsteps around her. Lily pulled her coat tighter, her breath fogging the air as she trudged through the snow. She was tired of the endless days at the diner, of scraping together tips, and especially of spending Christmas Eve alone. She felt like one of those snowflakes, lost in a crowd and destined to melt away. Her thoughts were interrupted by a glint in the snow near her feet. Bending down, she brushed the snow away, revealing a watch. But this wasn't any ordinary watch. The face was encased in gleaming silver, and its hands were thin, golden slivers. The kind of watch that could cover her rent for months, maybe even a year. She felt its weight in her palm, a solid, undeniable presence that sent her heart racing. Lily hesitated, looking around. Surely someone had noticed it was gone. Her fingers tightened around the watch as thoughts tumbled through her mind. She could sell it, use the money to buy herself a small Christmas gift, or even a warm coat. But the image of her mother's face drifted into her mind, reminding her of the principles she'd been taught: honesty, integrity, and kindness. No, she decided. She had to find the owner. After a few hours of trying to find out who belonged to, Lily finally stumbled upon a name engraved on the back: H. Grant. She vaguely recognized the name, a wealthy businessman rumored to live alone on the city's outskirts. She knew of his mansion, a place she'd never imagined visiting, much less on Christmas Eve. But determination swelled within her. She wasn't one to leave things undone. The mansion loomed in the distance as Lily trekked through the snow-laden streets, her steps muffled by the heavy silence that lay over Maple Street. The mansion was a towering, ivy-covered structure that seemed out of place amidst the city's modern glass buildings. Its old-world charm felt intimidating, and she felt her resolve waver. But the watch's weight in her pocket reminded her of her purpose. She climbed the marble steps, her breath fogging the chilled air as she stood before the massive front door. After a moment's hesitation, she rang the doorbell, listening as the echo faded into the house's depths. Moments later, the door opened to reveal a tall, older man with salt and pepper hair and a scrutinizing gaze. "Mr. Grant," she realized with a start. "Can I help you?" His voice was polite but distant, as if he had been expecting someone else. "Yes," Lily stammered, pulling the watch from her pocket and holding it out. "I think this belongs to you. I found it in the snow earlier tonight." He raised an eyebrow, his expression shifting from polite curiosity to something else, something almost like recognition. Without a word, he reached for the watch, his fingers brushing hers briefly. "This watch is very valuable," he said slowly, as if weighing each word. "Why didn't you keep it?" Lily shrugged, suddenly feeling self-conscious. "Yes, I thought it was the right thing to do." Mr. Grant's face softened, and for the first time, a glimmer of warmth entered his gaze. "Well, I'm grateful. Would you like to come in and warm up for a bit?" The warmth of the invitation surprised her. She stepped inside, taking in the grand foyer, decorated with rich tapestries, and an immense chandelier casting soft light over marble floors. The house felt like a world away from the life she knew, a place of wealth and isolation. "Can I get you something to drink? Hot chocolate, perhaps?" he asked, leading her into a study filled with leather-bound books and heavy, mahogany furniture. She nodded, accepting his offer, her eyes wandering over the carefully arranged holiday decorations that adorned the room. As they sat across from each other, Mr. Grant looked at her thoughtfully. "What's your name?" "Lily," she replied. "Lily Winters." "Thank you, Miss Winters," he said, looking down at the watch. His thumb brushed over the initials, H.G., and something unreadable passed across his face. "I can't help but wonder, what makes someone like you decide to return something so valuable?" Lily hesitated, feeling the weight of his gaze. "I was raised to believe in doing the right thing, no matter the cost," she said softly. Her words seemed to strike a chord, and Mr. Grant's expression shifted, a strange mix of surprise and something deeper. For a moment, they sat in silence, the crackling of the fire filling the space between them. Lily could feel the beginning of a connection, a strange, unspoken understanding between them. She glanced around, wondering if, perhaps, he was just as alone as she was this Christmas. Lily settled into the plush armchair across from Mr. Grant, feeling slightly out of place in such a grand setting. The fire crackled warmly beside her, and the rich scent of old leather and polished wood filled the air. She cradled the mug of hot chocolate he'd given her, letting its warmth spread through her fingers. The mansion's heavy silence hung around them, broken only by the ticking of a grandfather clock somewhere in the house. As Mr. Grant looked down at the watch in his hands, a faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, though his eyes remained distant. The watch seemed to hold memories for him, memories that hovered just out of reach. He looked up, catching Lily's gaze, and for a moment, there was an intensity there that made her heart skip. "Do you know," she began slowly, feeling the question form almost involuntarily, "this watch, it reminds me of one my father used to have." Mr. Grant's hand froze, his gaze sharpening. "Your father?" Lily nodded, hesitating as she remembered her father's watch. It had been a precious family heirloom, something her mother had said her father loved. But after his passing, it had vanished, as though it had been a part of him, leaving only memories behind. "Yes, he had a watch just like this one. I always thought it was special." Mr. Grant's expression turned thoughtful, almost haunted. He looked down at the watch as if seeing it for the first time. "Is that so?" he murmured, almost to himself. He seemed lost in thought, and for a moment, Lily wondered if she had overstepped. But then he surprised her. "Tell me about your father," he said, his tone softer now, inviting her to share. Lily felt a pang of sadness, but smiled as memories of her father came to mind. He was a kind man, generous with everyone. "My mother always said he had a way of making people feel seen. He worked hard but still found time for family, especially at Christmas." A flicker of something, regret perhaps, crossed Mr. Grant's face as he listened, and Lily noticed how his grip on the watch tightened. "He sounds like someone worth remembering," he said, his voice a bit strained. She sensed that he, too, was holding on to memories, but of whom or what, she couldn't tell. After a moment's pause, Mr. Grant leaned forward, as if to dispel the somberness in the room. "You have a good heart, Miss Winters. Returning this watch shows integrity. I appreciate that." He smiled briefly, though the warmth didn't quite reach his eyes. Their conversation drifted into lighter topics as they exchanged stories of their lives, each story building an invisible bridge between them. For Lily, who had spent many Christmases alone, this unexpected companionship filled a void she hadn't realized was so deep. She felt connected to Mr. Grant in a way she couldn't explain, as though they were two parts of a whole that had been separated long ago. As the clock struck midnight, she finally rose to leave, feeling a pang of reluctance. Mr. Grant walked her to the door, pausing as she looked back at the warm glow of the house behind her. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Mr. Grant's gaze lingered on her. "The pleasure was mine, Miss Winters. Merry Christmas." And with that, she stepped into the snowy night, the warmth of the evening staying with her long after she left. Christmas morning dawned cold and bright, casting a pale light over the city. As Lily woke in her small, cluttered apartment, her thoughts drifted back to the previous night. She hadn't expected much from Christmas Eve, but her encounter with Mr. Grant had given her a sense of warmth and connection she hadn't felt in years. A gentle knock at her door pulled her out of her thoughts. Curious, she opened it to find a neatly dressed courier holding an envelope with her name on it. Puzzled, she thanked him and opened it, her eyes widening at the contents. Inside was an elegant invitation printed on thick, expensive paper. It was from Mr. Grant, inviting her to join him for Christmas Day at his mansion. For a moment, she simply stared at it, disbelief warring with excitement. Part of her wanted to decline. She barely knew this man after all, but something about the invitation felt genuine, almost as if he, too, was searching for companionship on this holiday. After a moment's thought, she decided to accept. She dressed carefully, choosing her warmest sweater and set out for the mansion once more. Mr. Grant greeted her at the door, a faint smile softening his otherwise composed expression. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he admitted, holding the door open as she stepped inside. Lily returned his smile. "I wasn't sure either, to be honest, but I'm glad I did." They moved to the dining room, where a simple but elegant Christmas breakfast had been laid out. Mr. Grant gestured for her to sit, and they settled into an easy rhythm, talking and laughing as they shared the meal. Lily noticed how his guard seemed to drop just slightly, as if he was allowing her a glimpse of the man behind the stoic exterior. As they ate, he shared more about his life, and for the first time, Lily saw him as more than just a wealthy stranger. He was a man who had lived, loved, and, she suspected, suffered loss just as she had. Their conversation flowed, touching on memories, holiday traditions, and dreams unfulfilled. Then, almost casually, Mr. Grant began speaking about a woman he once knew, a woman who shared the same kindness and resilience he saw in Lily. His voice softened as he described her, and Lily felt a strange sensation, a stirring in her heart that resonated with his words. "She was remarkable," he said, his gaze distant. "She had a way of making everyone feel like they mattered, like they belonged. I often wonder what became of her." Lily's curiosity piqued, and she found herself asking, "Did you ever try to find her again?" Mr. Grant hesitated, his expression clouding. "No. I was too focused on other things back then, too caught up in my own ambitions. It's a regret I carry." His voice held a weight of sorrow, and Lily sensed that the story was unfinished, that perhaps there was more to this woman he spoke of than he was willing to admit. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. Lily felt a surge of empathy for Mr. Grant. Beneath his wealth and status, he seemed just as alone as she was. A small voice inside her whispered that maybe, just maybe, they had crossed paths for a reason. Before she left that afternoon, Mr. Grant looked at her with an expression that was almost vulnerable. "Thank you for spending Christmas with me, Miss Winters. It means more than you know." Lily smiled, feeling a warmth that was different from any she'd felt in years. "Thank you, Mr. Grant, for the invitation and for everything." As she stepped out of mansion, the chill of the air couldn't diminish the warmth she carried within. She felt a strange but profound connection to Mr. Grant, as if their stories were woven together in ways they had yet to discover. The following days passed with an unshakable sense of wonderment for Lily. She couldn't help but think about Mr. Grant's story, particularly the woman he'd spoken of with such tenderness. His words had left an indelible mark, hinting at a deep sorrow he carried, a loneliness that seemed to echo her own. She found herself hoping he might reach out again, though she hesitated to admit it. To her surprise, another letter arrived a few days after Christmas. Mr. Grant had invited her to visit again, this time for tea. A part of her wondered if this was wise. She barely knew him, after all, but curiosity and a growing attachment urged her forward. The mansion seemed even grander in the daylight, the snow reflecting the pale winter sun and casting a serene glow over the grounds. Mr. Grant greeted her warmly, his demeanor softened, as if her presence had unlocked a part of him he'd kept hidden for years. Over tea, their conversation drifted once more to the past, and she sensed that he wanted to open up to her, to unburden himself of memories that had weighed him down for too long. "There was a time," he began slowly, stirring his tea as though gathering his thoughts, "when I was a different man, ambitious, driven, but also blind to what truly mattered." Lily listened intently, feeling the vulnerability in his voice. "Is that why you never reconnected with her? The woman you spoke of?" He nodded, a shadow passing over his face. "I told myself there was always time, but by the time I was ready, she was gone, disappeared from my life without a trace. She left behind a child, I think, a little girl." His gaze dropped to his hands, and for a moment, he seemed lost in memories. Lily's heart skipped a beat as his words sank in. Her mother had raised her alone, never speaking of her father except in the vaguest of terms. Could it be? Could this man, sitting across from her, be her father? But doubt crept in. It felt too coincidental, too extraordinary to believe. She dismissed the thought, unwilling to give it power over her. Instead, she focused on Mr. Grant's expression, noting the sadness etched deeply in his features. "I'm sorry you lost her," she murmured, hoping to convey the empathy she felt. "Thank you," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I often wonder what became of that child. If she grew up happy, if she ever knew how much her mother cared for her." They sat in silence, the weight of unspoken truths hanging between them. For Lily, the possibility lingered, a whisper in the back of her mind, but she pushed it aside, unwilling to explore it further without more certainty. As she left that evening, Mr. Grant placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Thank you for listening, Miss Winters. It's been a long time since I could share these memories." Lily smiled, feeling the same sense of connection she'd felt on Christmas Eve. "Anytime, Mr. Grant. I'll see you soon." And with that, she walked out into the crisp winter evening, her heart heavier, yet somehow more hopeful than before. In the days that followed, Lily found herself preoccupied with thoughts of Mr. Grant. Each moment they'd shared replayed in her mind, but one thought above all else lingered, the possibility that he could be her father. It felt absurd, yet the coincidences kept gnawing at her, refusing to let her dismiss the notion entirely. One afternoon, Lily decided to visit her mother's favorite park, a place they had often gone to when she was a child. Sitting on a bench, she recalled her mother's stories, trying to piece together fragments that might connect to Mr. Grant. Her mother had always been vague about her past, but certain words surfaced. An important man, a wealthy life left behind. Was it possible that Mr. Grant was the man her mother had once cared for? Lost in thought, she didn't notice the figure approaching until a familiar voice interrupted her reverie. "Miss Winters." She looked up to find Mr. Grant standing there, bundled in a dark coat, his expression gentle but curious. "Mr. Grant," she said, surprised. "What are you doing here?" He shrugged, smiling slightly. "Just out for a walk. I didn't expect to see you here." They sat together in companionable silence for a moment, each lost in thought. Then, without prompting, he spoke again, his voice softer, more reflective. "You remind me of her sometimes, you know." Lily's breath caught. She dared ask, "Of the woman you told me about?" He nodded. "Yes. There's something in the way you carry yourself, your kindness. It reminds me so much of her." His gaze was distant, as though he were looking at someone else entirely. "I sometimes wonder if you might be related to her, somehow." The words hung in the air, a silent question neither was willing to ask outright. But the connection was undeniable, and for a fleeting moment, she wondered if he felt it too. She sensed the boundaries between them shifting, like the walls he had built were starting to crumble. "I've always felt a little out of place," she admitted, surprising herself with the admission. "Like there was something missing that I couldn't quite name." Mr. Grant nodded slowly, his expression contemplative. "Perhaps we both feel that way. Perhaps that's why we understand each other." They spent the afternoon walking through the park, sharing more memories and bits of their lives. Every moment together strengthened the connection between them, though neither spoke the words they were both thinking. It felt as though they were each afraid to shatter the fragile bond that had formed, to face the truth they both suspected. As they parted ways, Mr. Grant turned to her with an intensity in his gaze she hadn't seen before. "If you ever need anything, Miss Winters, please, don't hesitate to come to me. You're not alone." Lily felt a warmth spread through her, a sense of belonging she hadn't felt in years. "Thank you, Mr. Grant." "I'll remember that." They exchanged a final smile before she walked away, her heart filled with questions and a strange, unnameable hope. The pieces were slowly coming together, and though she was afraid of what she might find, she knew she couldn't turn back now. The days grew colder as January settled in, and with it, Lily's life resumed its usual rhythm. Yet her thoughts continued to drift back to Mr. Grant and the unresolved questions between them. The time they'd spent together had sparked a desire she couldn't ignore, a longing to know more about her past and perhaps to fill a void she'd carried all her life. Just as she was beginning to accept the ambiguity, another letter arrived from Mr. Grant, inviting her to dinner. She found herself at a crossroads. A part of her wanted to avoid getting too attached, fearing that this fragile connection might break under the weight of unanswered questions. But the thought of refusing felt equally painful. She sensed that he, too, was reaching for something real, something lasting, and the idea of sharing another evening together filled her with both hope and trepidation. After some thought, she decided to accept the invitation, resolving to keep her emotions in check. She arrived at the mansion just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow over the snow-covered grounds. Mr. Grant greeted her with a soft smile, looking more relaxed than she had ever seen him. "Thank you for coming, Miss Winters," he said, his voice warm. "I was afraid you might not accept." Lily returned his smile, feeling a strange mixture of excitement and caution. "I couldn't turn down the invitation." As they sat down to dinner, the conversation turned to lighter topics. Mr. Grant seemed eager to put her at ease, asking her about her day-to-day life, her dreams and ambitions. For once, she felt seen and valued, as if her voice truly mattered. Then, as dessert was served, he set down his fork and looked at her intently. "Miss Winters." "Lily," he began, his tone more serious. "I know we don't know each other well, but I feel a connection to you that I can't quite explain. I would like to help you, if you'll allow me." Lily's heart raced, caught off guard by his offer. "Help me?" "Yes," he replied, leaning forward. "I've spent many years focused on myself, and it has led to regret. If there's anything I can do to make a difference in your life, I would like to. I'm not sure what this might mean yet, but I want to be part of your life, if you'll let me." Lily hesitated, her emotions conflicted. Part of her longed to say yes, to accept his kindness, and explore the bond forming between them. But another part of her held back, wary of the potential pain if their connection was only an illusion. "I appreciate that," she said slowly, choosing her words carefully. "But I'm not sure if I'm ready to accept help. My life has been about independence, about standing on my own." Mr. Grant nodded, his gaze understanding yet firm. "I understand, but know that the offer stands. I won't press you, but I hope that, in time, you'll see me as someone you can rely on." They finished dinner in comfortable silence, both of them retreating into their thoughts. As he walked her to the door, he paused, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "Thank you, Lily, for allowing me to share this evening with you. It means more than you know." She smiled, her heart full, but her mind still cautious. "Thank you, Mr. Grant. I'll keep your offer in mind." As she left the mansion that night, Lily felt the beginnings of something she hadn't allowed herself to hope for, a chance at belonging, at finding a family. But fear lingered, warning her against trusting too easily. Several weeks passed, and winter's grip on the city remained unyielding. Lily's encounters with Mr. Grant had become the highlight of her days, though she maintained a careful distance, unsure of how deeply she wanted to be drawn into his life. But one morning, as she sat by her window watching the snow drift gently outside, her phone rang. It was Mr. Grant, his voice inviting but hesitant. "Lily, I was wondering if you'd care to join me for lunch. Just a casual meal. No pressure," he added, sensing her hesitation. Caught off guard by his invitation, she found herself accepting, and an hour later, she was walking through his gates once more, feeling both familiar and foreign. They settled into the cozy warmth of his study, where a small table had been set up with a simple but elegant meal. As they began to eat, he shared stories of his youth, his ambitions, his early struggles, and the sacrifices he'd made to reach the pinnacle of his success. He spoke about his regrets, the relationships he'd neglected, and the family he had let slip through his fingers. His words were filled with a sadness that tugged at Lily's heart, mirroring the loneliness she, too, had carried for so long. "You remind me so much of her," he said quietly, looking down at his plate. "Of someone I lost a long time ago. She had a strength, a resilience, much like you." Lily's curiosity deepened, and she found herself asking, did she know how much she meant to you? Mr. Grant paused, his expression distant. Perhaps, but I don't think I ever showed it well enough. I was too focused on other things, and by the time I realized what I had lost, it was too late. A silence settled between them, both of them lost in their own reflections. Lily could feel the weight of his words, as if he were confessing something he hadn't dared to admit before. Finally, she broke the silence. You know, I think she would have forgiven you. If she cared for you as much as you say, then she would have understood. Mr. Grant looked at her, a mixture of gratitude and sorrow in his eyes. Thank you, Lily. It means a lot to hear that. As they finished their meal, Lily felt a warmth blossom in her heart, a sense of compassion that bridged the gap between them. She realized that they were no longer strangers. They were two people bound by shared regrets, hopes, and the possibility of redemption. As the afternoon sun dipped lower in the sky, Mr. Grant reached out, his hand resting on hers. I can't change the past, but perhaps I can make a difference in the present, and maybe, in some small way, that can bring peace to both of us. Lily met his gaze, feeling a surge of hope. She nodded, her heart finally opening to the idea that maybe, just maybe, this connection was meant to be. The days stretched into February, and a sense of quiet understanding grew between Lily and Mr. Grant. Their visits became more frequent, their conversations deepening with each encounter. Yet the questions that lingered about her past, about their potential connection, remained unspoken, a silent thread that bound them but also kept them at a careful distance. One evening, as they sat in Mr. Grant's study, he surprised her by pulling out an old photo album from a cabinet. He set it on the table, his hands lingering on the worn cover as though it held memories too precious or too painful to release. This is from a time I've rarely shared with anyone, he murmured, opening the album to reveal faded photographs. Lily leaned closer, captivated by the images of a younger Mr. Grant, smiling alongside people she didn't recognize, but all with an air of warmth and happiness that contrasted with his present loneliness. As he turned the pages, he stopped at a photograph of a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Her face looked achingly familiar, and Lily felt her breath hitch. The resemblance to her own mother was unmistakable. This is her, Mr. Grant said softly, his gaze distant. Her name was Marianne. Lily's heart pounded. She could barely form the words as emotions swirled within her. Marianne, that's my mother's name. He looked at her, surprise mingling with realization in his eyes. Your mother. His voice was barely a whisper, but the intensity of his gaze made it clear that he, too, was beginning to put the pieces together. Mr. Grant, she began, her voice trembling. My mother never spoke much about my father. She always told me he was someone she loved but had to leave behind, because he had a life she couldn't be part of. Mr. Grant's face paled, and he set the album aside, his hands shaking slightly. Lily, I had no idea. Marianne and we were young, and I was so focused on my ambitions, on building a life that would make a difference. But in doing so, I left behind the one person who truly mattered. She must have left without telling me about you. Lily's heart clenched as the truth dawned on her. She looked into his eyes, seeing the same grief and regret that had haunted her for years. So, you're my father. Mr. Grant nodded, a tear escaping down his cheek. Yes, Lily, I believe I am. I can't believe. All these years. A mix of emotions overwhelmed her. Shock, sadness, even anger at the years of separation. But beneath it all was a sense of relief, of a missing puzzle piece finally falling into place. She had spent her life searching for this connection, for this sense of belonging, and now, here it was, albeit in the most unexpected way. They sat in silence, the weight of the revelation settling over them. Finally, Mr. Grant spoke, his voice raw with emotion. I don't expect you to forgive me. I failed you and your mother. But if you'll let me, I'd like to make things right, to be there for you now. Lily swallowed, the pain still fresh, but the hope in his eyes touched her heart. I don't know if it's something that can just be fixed, she said honestly. But I'd like to try. Mr. Grant's face softened, gratitude and hope mingling in his expression. Thank you, Lily. That's more than I could have ever hoped for. They embraced, a tentative but heartfelt gesture that spoke of both healing and the start of a new journey. And as they sat together, father and daughter at last, Lily felt a sense of peace settle within her, a feeling she had never thought possible. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of emotions for Lily. The revelation that Mr. Grant was her father had both answered and raised countless questions. She found herself grappling with the newfound knowledge, trying to reconcile the image of her absent father with the man she was now getting to know. During one of their meetings, she finally voiced her frustration. "It's hard, you know," she said, her voice trembling. "To think that all these years you were out there living your life, while my mother and I were left on our own." Mr. Grant's face softened with sorrow. "I know, Lily. I can't undo the choices I made. I was young and foolish. My ambitions blinded me to what really mattered. I thought I was building a future for myself, but in the end, I lost the very people I should have cherished." Lily's voice was firm, her emotions bubbling to the surface. "You could have looked for us. You could have tried to find us, to be there in some way." Mr. Grant bowed his head, the weight of regret evident in his posture. "You're right. I could have, and I should have. I've spent many nights haunted by that realization. But there's nothing I can say that will make up for what you went through." Tears blurred her vision as the pain of her childhood loneliness resurfaced. She had spent so many years longing for a father, for someone to be there for her and her mother. And now, facing him, she struggled to find forgiveness for the absence that had shaped her life. After a moment, she took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I don't know if I can ever fully forgive you for that, but I want to try, for my own sake. And maybe for Mom's sake, too." Mr. Grant reached out, his hand covering hers. "Thank you, Lily. I know I don't deserve your kindness, but I'll do everything I can to make up for lost time, to be there for you now." They spent the rest of the evening talking openly, sharing memories and stories. Mr. Grant spoke of his youth, of the struggles and sacrifices he had made to achieve success. Lily shared stories of her mother, painting a picture of the woman who had raised her with strength and love despite the hardships. As the evening wore on, they both felt a shift in their relationship. No longer were they two strangers bound by chance. They were father and daughter, facing the complexities of family and forgiveness together. Lily felt her heart slowly begin to open, allowing space for this newfound relationship to take root. As she left the mansion that night, she felt a sense of liberation, as though a burden she had carried for years was beginning to lift. She didn't know what the future held, but she was willing to give her father a chance to be part of it. The following weeks were marked by tentative steps toward healing for Lily and Mr. Grant. They spent more time together, exploring the budding relationship between them, but the process was not without its struggles. The pain of the years they had missed, the hardships Lily had endured without a father, and the regrets that haunted Mr. Grant, these burdens could not simply vanish. One evening, after a difficult conversation about her childhood, Lily found herself feeling overwhelmed. She had shared memories of the many sacrifices her mother had made to keep their small family afloat, the countless nights her mother had worked late shifts just to make ends meet. The thought of her mother's struggles resurfaced a raw anger within her, a feeling that Mr. Grant's absence had made everything harder for them. Mr. Grant listened, remorse evident in his eyes, but his apologies could only go so far. The realization that his choices had impacted her life so deeply weighed on him, and Lily could see the guilt in his face. Yet, knowing his regret didn't soothe her pain. After their conversation, she returned home, emotions roiling within her. She felt torn between the desire to embrace this new relationship and the lingering resentment that simmered beneath the surface. The connection they had built felt fragile, as though it might shatter if she couldn't find a way to let go of her bitterness. In the quiet of her apartment, she found herself spiraling into doubt. The memories of her lonely childhood, of watching other children with their fathers, flooded her mind, making her question whether she could truly forgive him. The following morning, she skipped her usual visit to Mr. Grant's mansion, needing space to sort through her feelings. Hours passed, and as the afternoon turned to evening, her phone buzzed with a message from him. "Lily, I hope you're well. I missed seeing you today. Please let me know if there's anything I can do." She read the message, her heart conflicted. He was trying, and she could see that. But could she bring herself to meet him halfway? As she sat in her room, wrestling with her feelings, she remembered something her mother had once told her during a particularly difficult time. "Holding on to anger only builds walls, sweetheart. If you ever want peace, sometimes you have to let things go." Her mother's words resonated with her now more than ever. She realized that she wasn't just holding on to her father's absence. She was holding on to all the pain and resentment that had accumulated over the years. And if she wanted to move forward, she would have to find a way to release that burden. Gathering her resolve, she decided to visit Mr. Grant the next day, hoping to confront her feelings and give their relationship a real chance. The next morning, Lily arrived at Mr. Grant's mansion, her emotions a mixture of anxiety and determination. As she knocked on the door, she steadied herself, reminding herself of her mother's advice. She was here to try, if not for her father's sake, then for her own peace of mind. Mr. Grant greeted her with a warm but hesitant smile, sensing the weight of her visit. They settled into his study, where the familiar surroundings provided a sense of comfort and familiarity. "Thank you for coming, Lily," he said softly, his gaze sincere. "I know I've caused you a great deal of pain, and I don't expect your forgiveness to come easily. But I'm here, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to earn it." Lily took a deep breath, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I appreciate that, Mr. Grant, and I do see that you're trying. But it's hard. It's hard to let go of the anger, the resentment. It's been a part of me for so long." Mr. Grant nodded, his expression one of understanding and regret. "I can't take away the years we lost or the pain my absence caused you. But I want you to know that if I could go back and make different choices, I would. In a heartbeat." His words were sincere, and she could feel the weight of his remorse. For a long moment, they sat in silence, each of them processing the depth of their emotions. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I want to try to forgive you. Not just for you, but for me. I don't want to carry this bitterness anymore." A look of relief and gratitude crossed his face. "Thank you, Lily. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm grateful that you're willing to try." As they continued to talk, Lily felt a release, a sense of liberation, as she voiced her pain and allowed herself to confront the hurt she had carried for so long. For the first time, she felt a sense of closure, as though the walls she had built around her heart were finally beginning to come down. By the time they finished their conversation, she realized that her anger had started to dissipate, replaced by a feeling of acceptance and, surprisingly, hope. She knew that the process of forgiveness would be ongoing, but she also felt a sense of peace she hadn't known before. They shared a quiet moment, both of them feeling the shift in their relationship. Mr. Grant reached out, gently placing his hand on hers, and she allowed the gesture, feeling a warmth spread through her. "Thank you, Lily," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be the father you deserve." Lily smiled, feeling the beginnings of true forgiveness settle within her. "That's all I ask, Dad." The word felt strange on her tongue, but also right. And as they sat together in silence, Lily knew that this was the start of something new, a relationship grounded in understanding, acceptance, and the promise of a future they could both look forward to. As winter began to melt into early spring, the bond between Lily and Mr. Grant deepened in ways neither had anticipated. The tentative relationship that had once been overshadowed by the pain of the past was now growing stronger, rooted in forgiveness and understanding. They met regularly, and each visit felt easier, more natural, as they shared laughter, memories, and plans for the future. One afternoon, Mr. Grant surprised Lily with an invitation to tour his family estate, a place he had rarely shared with anyone. The estate was vast, with sprawling gardens, ancient trees, and a small pond nestled among the greenery. The air was fresh, and the sound of birds chirping filled the quiet spaces between them as they strolled through the grounds. Mr. Grant spoke of the history of the estate, his voice warm and reminiscent. "This place has been in our family for generations. I always imagined I would pass it down to my family." Lily looked at him, sensing the significance of his words. "It's beautiful," she said softly, touched that he was sharing this part of himself with her. They walked to the edge of the pond, where a small bench overlooked the water. Sitting side by side, they watched the gentle ripples on the surface, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Mr. Grant broke the silence. "Lily," he began, his voice filled with a mixture of hope and vulnerability, "I know that I've missed so much of your life, and I can never replace those lost years. But if you'd allow me, I'd like to be there for you in whatever way I can, from now on." The sincerity in his words touched her deeply, and she reached over, placing a reassuring hand on his. "I'd like that," she replied, a soft smile spreading across her face. "I'd like that very much." They sat in companionable silence, the weight of the past giving way to a newfound hope for the future. Lily felt a sense of belonging she had never known, a feeling that perhaps, after all these years, she had found the family she had always longed for. As they walked back to the mansion, Mr. Grant mentioned plans to establish a charitable foundation in honor of her mother, to help single mothers and families in need. The gesture filled Lily with gratitude, and she felt her mother's memory honored in a way that was both meaningful and lasting. For the first time, the future felt bright, and Lily allowed herself to envision a life with her father by her side, building new memories, creating traditions, and cherishing each moment together. As Christmas approached once more, the mansion was filled with the warmth and cheer that had been absent for so long. Decorations adorned every corner, and the scent of pine and cinnamon wafted through the air. Lily, now a welcome and regular presence in Mr. Grant's life, took great joy in preparing for the holiday, helping him choose ornaments and decorating the grand Christmas tree that stood proudly in the foyer. They spent the days leading up to Christmas engaged in preparations, wrapping gifts, baking treats, and planning a holiday dinner. Mr. Grant seemed almost transformed, his face softened by laughter and joy that Lily hadn't seen when they first met. It was as though the spirit of the season had rekindled a part of him that had been dormant for years. On Christmas Eve, they gathered by the fire, each holding a cup of hot chocolate, watching the flames dance in the quiet warmth of the room. As midnight approached, Mr. Grant handed Lily a small, wrapped gift. "Open it," he urged, his eyes twinkling with anticipation. Lily carefully unwrapped the package, revealing a delicate silver locket. She opened it to find two tiny photographs inside, one of her mother and one of her, taken when she was a young girl. Tears filled her eyes as she looked at her mother's smiling face, preserved forever in this precious keepsake. "It belonged to your mother," Mr. Grant explained softly. "I thought it was time it came back to you, a piece of her, to carry with you always." Lily hugged him, her gratitude too profound for words. "Thank you," she whispered, feeling the warmth of her mother's memory settle within her heart. As they sat together, enveloped in the glow of the fire and the twinkling lights of the Christmas tree, Lily realized how far they had come. They were no longer strangers bound by coincidence, but family bound by love, forgiveness, and the shared promise of a future they would build together. When Christmas morning arrived, they exchanged gifts and shared a simple but heartfelt meal, laughter filling the room as they recounted the journey that had brought them to this moment. For Lily, this was more than a holiday. It was a celebration of the life she had gained, a life filled with the love of a father she had finally come to know. As they sat by the window, watching the snow fall softly outside, Mr. Grant placed his arm around her, and Lily leaned into him, feeling a peace she had never known before. "Merry Christmas, Dad," she murmured, her voice filled with joy. "Merry Christmas, Lily," he replied, his voice full of love. And as the snow continued to fall, they sat together, knowing that this Christmas was only the beginning of the many they would share, side by side as family. Hey everyone, if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and leave a like. We'd love to hear from you. Let us know in the comments what moment had the most impact on you. Was it the unexpected family reunion, the journey of forgiveness, or maybe the heartwarming Christmas ending? Your thoughts mean a lot to us, and we can't wait to hear which part spoke to you the most. And while you're at it, feel free to leave suggestions for new story ideas you'd like to see on the channel. We're always looking for exciting themes, twists, and heartfelt stories to bring to life. Thanks for being part of our community, and we look forward to reading your comments.